Now, a lot of people want to try and target specific strengths. And this is not necessarily a bad idea, especially whenever somebody is highly trained. For instance, we know that an offensive lineman fires out of their stance at about 1.5 meters per second average velocity. Uh, Now, I was unable to separate out what the steps were, and I labeled it speed strength, even though it was over 1.3 meters per second. But that included the second and third step as they were going to make contact with the bag. So if we tapered that down, I think we'd be about 1.2, 1.1, so that would definitely be speed strength. After contact, based off of a video analysis, whenever an athlete was dominating their opponent, they were only moving at about their center of mass at about zero point 0.6 meters per second. So then that would indicate accelerative strength was used. And that's on one of the drills that whenever the athletes, we call them the boards, whenever they, offensive linemen, defensive linemen, they fire out against each other and fight for the line of scrimmage. They may move slower than that, which it would indicate circumax or max. And what else would that be indicative of? What else would be required for this? And that is not included into this analysis here is technique and how you could utilize your hands, which would be technique, to be able to disable your opponent. But whenever we look at things, we know that an offensive lineman, they can't just train one thing and that's it. There might be more areas that they need less work in, but they still need to train a little bit of everything. Now, how does it work? Well, we have measured the speed of the bar, and Jennings et al. Showed that the devices were accurate for that. It provides immediate feedback, which is key for so many aspects of motivation. The different lifts have different speeds, as we've already talked about. Well, actually, we haven't talked about, but we have talked about the different strengths having different speeds. And the athlete moves their proper weight for that exact set. So with the instant feedback, the immediate feedback rather, it's instantaneous and it's objective. It doesn't matter who the athlete is. Is it a Heisman candidate or a walk-on? It doesn't have eyes, it doesn't have feelings, it just knows the speed. As such, it encourages a competitive nature. You just simply by throwing the velocity device out there, athletes start competing. Like, oh, you got, what speed did you get? I'm going to beat you. So they start working harder, which leads to a greater quality of work. And it serves as another coach on the floor. And by another coach on the floor, I mean it helps you to dictate the load. It doesn't tell you if the technique was good. So you still have to pay attention to technique, but you can always try and utilize the velocity for the load. Now, with that immediate feedback, there was a paper from Randall et al. And we know that on that paper were also Mike McGuigan and Nick Gill. And if you don't know the name Nick Gill, he's a strength coach for the New Zealand All Blacks, who's been there for quite some time. And they are the winningest sporting organization in the world, the history of the world. Well, they did 6 weeks of training where everybody did the same loads. Everybody did the same sets, reps. They had the same rest. They did the same exercises. Only one thing varied. On 2 days per week on their jump squats, one group received the feedback of their velocity and the other group did not. So that was the only change, was feedback. We look and we see that at vertical jump, the group that received feedback went up 4.6 versus 2.8%. We see the group that, for the horizontal jump, a standing long jump, they went up 2.6 for the group that had velocity, and the other group only went up 0.5%. Then we also see with the 10-meter sprint that the group that received velocity improved 1.3% versus 0.1. 20-meter was 0.9 versus 0.1. And at the 30-meter time was 1.4 versus 0.3. So that we see that we have greater improvements just by giving the feedback of velocity. What that means is you don't have to change anything about your program. If you just give them the feedback of their velocity on some key movements that are done for power, for speed, you improve the results and the efficacy of your program. Some people talk about, if they should use velocity or if they should use power and training at peak power. Well, the issue with training at peak power is that is only one area. And if we look back at the Kaneko study from 1983, as I keep referring back to, we know that power can be affected by super heavy loads, moderate loads, fairly light loads, and even unloaded. So we know by doing the different velocities what we're actually going to be training versus just training peak power, because then that's only giving us essentially one load, probably around between 30 and 60% of 1 RM based off of the individual and based off of the lift. Now, I like utilizing velocity because I'm going towards not to peak power, but I'm probably going to be going towards strength, speed, or speed strength whenever I am training power. With power, some people would say, oh, it's not that accurate. It's not accurate. It hasn't been validated. Well, it's been validated within about 12 watts of a force plate. So if you look at that, I'll take it. Give me 12 watts in air any day of the week. 12 watts out of 5,000. That's not a problem. That's something I can definitely handle as far as air goes. Now, the different lifts have some different velocities, and specifically the Olympic lifts. Now, the Olympic lifts are going to have different velocities because they've got a greater range of motion, and their intent is also greater. Like I said before, they're speed strength by nature. Now, with the hang power snatch and the hang power clean, so going from the hang and catching it above the shoulders, for the snatch, above your head rather, and then the hang power clean is catching it in the quarter squat position, is what power means, and then the clean, of course, catching it at their shoulders. We know that a hang power snatch moves at about 1.96 meters per second, and a hang power clean at about 1.32 meters per second. And then we look at the peaks as those occur, and these are approaching 1 RM velocities. And that low twos peak is on for training over here. That's listed. These are approaching 1 RM. The 1 RM velocity for a hang power clean. For peak velocity tends to be about 1.44 meters per second for most football players. Now, clean pulls and snatch pulls were dealing whenever somebody was trying to overload the movement. And those are listed at 1.15 and 1.45 meters per second. What's the difference? It is the grip, the snatch grip versus the clean grip. Now, I do want to give a side note that a lot of people follow my work, and earlier on I was just looking at the mean velocity for the Olympic lifts. And that's all I was prescribing. Well, one of the things that and why did I start off that way? Well, because at the time, whenever I started utilizing velocity, and other people around the world did as well, the only velocity that was given was mean. So that's what I had the most work with. Now, the peak velocity, one of the things that I noticed was that with football players, and I keep mentioning football because that's who I have the most experience working with, they had a lot of orthopedic issues. Elbows, shoulders, wrists were beat up from all the contact. Well, one thing that we would see is that the athletes would have this extremely fast pull, but their catch was a little wonky because they were trying to get around injury. They were trying to make sure that it didn't hurt, which is completely understandable. So they would alter their form on the catch to slow the bar down whenever they were receiving it. And that led to a decrease in mean velocity because the mean velocity is the mean from the start to the end of that repetition. So if they have a super fast pull and a slow catch, it ends up being a low average velocity. So whenever I would see that, I knew that there was a form discrepancy. And again, it was often their inability to catch. So whenever we looked at peak velocity, we tended to see better on what the movement should be and what the load should be. And I've mentioned Dr. Andy Fry already. He has his That Looks About Right method. And whenever we went to peak velocity with those athletes, we were seeing the loads at which we would expect them to be moving on those exercises versus far lighter and inefficient movements, inefficient in terms of transfer. So here's some of the peaks that I've been using for 1 RM velocities. For most of your team sport athletes, you can go down to the left. If they are Olympic lifters, you might need to go over to the right. Again, these are 1 RM velocities. Now, why do those vary? Because of technical proficiency. So somebody can just simply move the bar faster if they're taller. However, with football players, they tend to just alter their form, so the range of motion isn't tremendously different from a 6'6" to a 5'6" athlete. And we saw that the average velocity of the 1RM on the clean was about 1.45 meters per second for a 1AA football team. So, and height was irrelevant for that.